Welcome to Design Santa Barbara. I'm Michael Kurash, and today we are in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, exploring its iconic building, beautiful art galleries, and its historic sites. Please join us. Washington, D.C. is the capital city and only federal district of the United States. It's located on the east bank of the Potomac River, which forms its southern border with the state of Virginia and shares a land border with the state of Maryland. The city was named for George Washington, the first president of the United States, and the federal district is named after Columbia, a female personification of the nation. As the seat of the U.S. federal government and several international organizations, the city is an important political capital. It is one of the most visited cities in the U.S., seeing over 20 million people travel there annually. In the years after the American Revolution, the formally designated capital of the United States moved from city to city, including New York and Philadelphia. With the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1790, Article 1, Section 8 called for the establishment of a permanent district to become the seat of government of the United States of America. On July 9, 1790, Congress passed the Residence Act, which approved the creation of a national capital on the Potomac River. The exact location was to be selected by President George Washington, who signed the bill into law on July 16th, formed from land donated by the states of Maryland and Virginia. The initial shape of the federal district was a square measuring 10 miles on each side, totaling 100 square miles. President Washington appointed Pierre Charles L'Enfant to devise a plan for the new city. The Enfant Plan, as it came to be known, called for a grid centered on the United States Capitol, which would stand on the top of a hill. North, south, and east-west streets formed the grid. Wider diagonal grand avenues, later named after the States of Union, crossed the grid. Enfant's broadest grand avenue was a 400-foot wide garden-lined esplanade that became the National Mall. This allowed a direct line from the seat of Congress to the Executive Mansion. Construction on the city immediately began, and in 1791, the city was formally named in honor of President Washington. After several conflicts with the city's planning commission, Enfant departed the project, and surveyor Andrew Ellicott, who helped select the site, was brought on to finish the construction. Here you can see Enfant's original plan submitted to George Washington, followed by a revised plan. And finally, the hybrid Enfant-Ellicott plan that was used for construction. In 1800, the seat of government was finally moved to the new city. And on February 27, 1801, the District of Columbia Organic Act placed the district under the jurisdiction of Congress. The act also organized the unincorporated territory within the district into two counties: the County of Washington on the northeast bank of the Potomac and the County of Alexandria on the southwest bank. On May 3, 1802, the city of Washington was granted a municipal government consisting of a mayor appointed by the President of the United States. The centerpieces of this new capital included the Capitol Building, the White House, the Treasury Building, and the War Office. In its early years, Washington, D.C.'s residents clashed with the House and Senate over building improvements, which Congress had financial control of. Throughout the first decade of the 19th century, a series of canals were constructed and the city began to grow. But one fateful event during the War of 1812 changed the course of our nation's capital's history. In August 1814, 2 years into the second major conflict between the United States and Great Britain, a decisive victory by English forces left Washington, D.C. strategically vulnerable. Redcoats marched on the city and began to set fire to American government buildings. In a truly heroic act, First Lady Dolly Madison helped load the iconic and priceless Lansdowne portrait of George Washington into a carriage as enemy troops entered the city. Had she not risked her own life to do this, the painting would surely have been lost. For only moments later, as she and her husband, President James Madison, fled the besieged city, the forces of the United Kingdom set fire to the White House. The destruction of Washington, D.C. sent shockwaves across the United States. After emerging victorious from the War of 1812, it was proposed that the ruined Capitol be abandoned and the seat of government be moved back to Philadelphia. The proposal was narrowly defeated in Congress, and reconstruction of Washington, D.C. began. By the 1830s, Washington, D.C. was a thriving city of 20,000. With the arrival of the B&O Railroad in 1835, travel to the city from northern and southern population centers became much easier. During its hot, humid summers, the city was known to thin to as few as 5,000 residents as people sought more comfortable climate. As America continued to grow, so did its capital. The halls of Congress were expanded and plans were drawn up to build a massive, imposing Capitol dome that could be seen for miles. With rising tensions between the North and South coming to a head after the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln, the country was thrown into civil war. Washington, D.C.'s proximity to the Mason-Dixon line made it a prime target for Confederate attack, so the city was heavily fortified the entire duration of the war and was only attacked once during the 4-year conflict. With numerous government and military jobs required by the war, Washington, D.C.'s population more than tripled to over 75,000 people. Though work on the massive obelisk monument to George Washington was halted by the war, President Lincoln was adamant that construction of the Capitol dome continue. After the war, the city continued to grow. By 1870, the population was over 100,000 people. In 1877, the Washington Post newspaper began printing, and 1 year later, the first telephones were installed in the city. President Rutherford B. Hayes became the first U.S. head of state to make a phone call, speaking to telephone inventor Alexander Graham Bell some 13 miles away. In 1885, the towering Washington Monument was finally completed and dedicated. At 555 feet tall, it was the tallest structure in the world until the Eiffel Tower was completed 4 years later. The discoloration from the Civil War construction delay can be seen to this day. Throughout the Gilded Age, Washington, D.C. continued to grow. Electric streetcar service commenced, and embassies of foreign nations were constructed. Today, the city hosts 177 foreign embassy offices. In 1901, a commission set out to redesign the National Mall and created a space that evoked the grandeur of great European capitals such as London, Paris, and Rome. This included dedicated spaces around the core government offices to parks and monuments. The crowning achievement of this remodel was the Lincoln Memorial, dedicated in 1922. As the 20th century progressed, Washington, D.C. grew into one of the most respected cities on earth. The Supreme Court building was completed, the Pentagon became a hub of U.S. defense, and countless monuments were constructed for titans of American history. Let's look at some of them now. One of the greatest things about Washington, D.C. isn't even a building. It's an idea. An idea enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. A right to demonstrate and speak your mind. Washington, D.C. has played host to peaceful protests for as long as it has existed. Women's rights, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, No matter what your political beliefs are, you have an open forum for civil discourse in our nation's capital. Despite all this, Washington, D.C.'s biggest fault may be its lack of representation for its own residents. As a federal district, it has no elected senators, and its sole member of the U.S. House can't vote. To this day, citizens of Washington, D.C. have adopted a motto from the Revolutionary War: taxation without representation. For most of the world's capitals, they are cities that took root in antiquity and were built into seats of power: London, Paris, Berlin, etc. Washington, D.C. is unique in that it was built for one singular purpose: to run the United States. It has grown and flourished into one of the most beautiful cities of the world, and for that reason, we are honored to name this magnificent town one of Design Santa Barbara's great cities. I hope you have enjoyed this view of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Looking forward to seeing you next week on Design Santa Barbara.